Your boy Matt here. I've been spending the last couple of days trying to figure out how to communicate some points, and this is not going to be the best product of that work. This is a very brief video intended to just express my great disappointment and frustration in the leadership for psychology in Australia. So, psychology's been in Australia for a very long time. It's been around for decades. It's this bizarre discipline which exists in a healthcare sense between psychiatry and social work. By this I mean a psychologist is able to provide diagnosis, and they're a shit ton cheaper to train than a psychiatrist. And at the same time, they do similar work to what we'd expect a counsellor or a social worker to do. They provide talk therapies, and this is from an overall healthcare perspective, from a governance perspective. Psychology provides very little value to the community as a healthcare service, dollar for dollar, because everything a psychologist can do for the majority of their work, with the exception of diagnosis, can be provided by a counsellor or a social worker. You look at the dollar to dollar amounts. If you're going to train a counsellor or a psychologist has a minimum of 3 degrees. They have to be bizarrely conscientious, bizarrely intelligent. Well, bizarrely intelligent is a big stretch, but they can't be stupid. Well, they can be stupid. You'd struggle if you have a low IQ. IQ really is a very good measure of academic performance. It's got good predictive validity in that, and because of the gauntlet that psychologists need to go through, it would function as a rough sort of a very rough measure of intelligence, very rough. But the issue is that, yeah, from the policymakers' perspective, they don't have the ability to. They don't have the same legal authorities, and they're not baked into as many medical institutions with a legal respect as are psychiatrists. Psychiatrists have specific roles in certain courts. They have a lot of authority over involuntarily mentally ill people. Psychologists tend to have less authority in some systems than psychiatrists. And for some bizarre reason, there's an overall inference that psychologists are less capable than psychiatrists, which is a fucking joke. Like, psychiatrists, they spend their time studying medicine and they're like, oh, now I'm interested about people. Well, you don't get the same kind of deeply... Well, they're going to be there in psychiatry, but because of the gauntlet, psychologists are always passionate people. It is impossible to run for the gauntlet and want to engage with mental health and mental illness. It's impossible to run this gauntlet without being bizarrely passionate about the subject. Psychiatry is a discipline which they actually struggle to recruit for. People who study medicine, they don't tend to want to do psychiatry. They want to, and as such, there's actually a lot of work done by the psychiatric professional bodies to attract medical students into psychiatry. There's the opposite issue with psychology, where a very elaborate hazing system was developed. And that was also because the discipline has struggled with credibility, because it's needed to look at these bars of academic hazing as a means of trying to make it look official. As a credible discipline. I don't think it works as effectively in that regard as people think. I think the overall result for the discipline is that there's a lot of people who think in very bureaucratic terms. I think the scientific aspect of psychology has been forgotten. It's become really pretentious, and there are many quite useless people who just go about by mouthing some ideology that the previous generation of psychologists would say, and there's this there's this ideology surrounding the whole culture in psychology in Australia. returning to my point, it's just much cheaper to provide a counselling service with counsellors. They are quicker to train, and they do just as good of a job. You can train a counsellor. Counsellor doing CBT is going to be the same as a psychologist doing CBT. And because of these issues, because of that, the APS and the historical employer bodies, and advocacy groups for the discipline of psychology, they've kind of carved this sort of niche by trying to puff up the chest of psychology as a discipline to make it seem legitimate and authoritarian, to justify the insane amount of money it costs to train these psychs, because we've got a government subsidised healthcare in Australia, university in Australia. HECS is only half of it. Your help debt basically pays for something like half of a degree. The rest is done by the government in a lot of instances. Returning to my point, it costs a lot to train them, and they don't provide any benefit. And so there's been this marketing thing with psychs. The entire thing's bullshit. What we need in psychology is leadership, which carves out a unique role for psychologists in this system, and that will then get government funding and subsidies for the discipline. At the moment, there's nothing that we provide. The role of a psychologist, in my view, should be to diagnose and provide assessments and tests. It's a social scientist job. I hate this idea of the scientist practitioner. It's like, not scientist practitioner, you're a fucking scientist, right? You take measurements and you work with statistical categories. What's happened when people have used this term scientist practitioner is that we've got all these people in the discipline who are like, kind of being like, oh yeah, I'm a counsellor who occasionally does diagnosis. But what the fuck was all the money from the government for then, mate? Right? Like, if you're looking at this from a managerial perspective, you want a return on investment. Get these psychologists doing the diagnosis, so doing the tests for autism, ADHD. We've got a big backlog in that. And have these people do the IQ test, the personality test, and the diagnosis in a consultancy role with other healthcare professionals, with the counsellors. I think there is a place for psychologists to have a role in a counselling capacity. They need to have that so that they're able to keep a grounding and understanding the populations they're working with, and so that they can relate to the input that they would get from the counsellors. But the job needs to serve a useful function. That's the kind of role which I see psychologists as being able to do. We're cheaper to train than psychiatrists. And it also avoids the issue where we end up in a pissing competition with the medical guys. Right? They've got their own interests as well. They want to keep their little part of the pie. So for now, I think there just needs to be a restructuring of the discipline of psychology into what it provides, what it can usefully provide for the community. The question needs to be asked, right? What's the point? What are we here for? And at the moment, the leadership in psychology in Australia can't answer that. Well, definitely not the APS at any rate. Have a good one.